So yesterday we got the Diablo 4 developer livestream where we got a ton of new information going over everything we can expect in Season 4, including what is actually going to be the Season 4 theme and including a lot of the feedback they got from PTR. So in this video, I mainly wanted to do an overview of all of the big systems and changes coming with Season 4, including the Season 4 theme. And while going over all of that, we'll go over some of the more important changes that the developers changed due to PTR feedback. Now to start off, we have what's actually going to be the theme of Season 4, and as I predicted, the Season 4 theme and Season 4 specific content isn't going to be very substantial. In fact, a good chunk of the new Season 4 content is actually going to be permanent as well. So a lot of the new things coming with the Iron Wolf faction, which is going to be introduced with Season 4, is actually going to be permanent. So now in Helltides, there's going to be Iron Wolves around fighting all the different demons. There's going to be whispers within the Helltides that are based around helping the Iron Wolves, and the Iron Wolves are going to have their own encampment, and all of that is actually going to be permanent after Season 4. But we do get a few new things coming specifically with Season 4 that are only going to be in Season 4, and that includes a Season 4 questline. So you go through a questline with the Iron Wolves investigating the rise in Helltides. So we'll be getting a little bit of story throughout that questline helping out the Iron Wolves, but the main thing we're getting is actually the Iron Wolf reputation, which is called Wolf's Honor, doing a bunch of different objectives throughout Helltide. You're going to be getting reputation with the Iron Wolves, and there's going to be a pretty rewarding reward track, very similar to what we got with Season 2. So you just keep getting reputation and you get a bunch of rewards. And this one is being designed around you going from level 1 to 100 and getting pretty strong items going through that. And we can already see from the reward track that we're going to be getting a bunch of legendary items. We're going to be getting some unique items. Once you complete the full reward track, you're going to be getting a resplendent spark, which is the resource you need to craft uber unique items. We're going to be getting some tempering manuals for one of the new crafting systems. And it does also sound like some of the legendary items we're getting from this reward track are also going to be better rolled items. How I took this is that these items are going to have guaranteed greater affixes on them, which is actually something I theorized when we first got the Iron Wolf leaked information, that it would make sense that they just want to give us a bit of a boost into all of the new systems. So giving us items with guaranteed greater affixes is a very good way to do that. And then finally, we're going to be getting the Profane Mind Cage, which is an elixir I've talked about before. And this Mind Cage is actually pretty cool. It basically allows you to juice up Helltides a little bit. So it'll increase the enemy's levels in Helltides by 10, which will give you more experience, make them quite a bit harder, but it's going to be increasing your cinder drops for Helltides and increasing your threat level. So pretty much every important aspect of Helltides is going to be buffed from this Mind Cage, but it's going to make all the enemies a bit more difficult. This is also going to be usable while you're leveling up. So if you have a pretty strong build, using a Profane Mind Cage while leveling up in Helltides is actually going to be pretty good in giving you more experience and just buffing up everything else you're doing in Helltides. And that's actually everything we're getting specifically for Season 4 that's going to be removed at the end of the season. But the Iron Wolves being in Helltides, there being Iron Wolf specific whispers and other objectives within Helltides that are specifically revolving around Iron Wolves are all going to be added permanently into the game. So the vast majority of new content, new additions and changes coming with Season 4 are actually going to be permanent. And I know some people have been a bit let down by this, but this season and all of the new content and changes we're getting with Season 4 is actually going to make this by far the biggest season we've gotten so far, even though most of this stuff is permanent. It's not like we're not getting a ton of new stuff. It's just that instead of a lot of it being tied to a season and getting removed at the end of that season, instead of that, the majority of the stuff is just staying. Now that brings us to the permanent overhauls coming with Season 4, which is going to make up a majority of the new content and changes we're getting, starting with just general itemization changes. Some of the biggest being the reduction of the amount of affixes you can get on items. So rare are going from 4 to 2, legendary are going from 4 to 3, meaning legendary at the high end is going to be basically the only items besides uniques that you're using. You're not going to be using rare items in the end game. One of the big pieces of feedback is that they did say they are looking into magic and rare items in the future. They have some ideas of what those items are actually going to be, because once we get into season 4, once you get, say, into World Tier 3, you're not really going to be using rare items besides to salvage them for more resources. But on top of the amount of affixes getting reduced, all of the affixes are going to be stronger. So instead of, say, getting an item that can roll up to 50 intelligence, it can now, say, roll up to 80 or 100. So you're getting less affixes on item drops in total, but all of those affixes are going to be much stronger, meaning you're actually going to feel the power difference of getting a new affix, because they're just going to be giving a lot more power per affix. And on top of all of that, they've actually reduced the amount of different affixes you can get on dropped items by a pretty significant amount. Most of the affixes you're actually getting on dropped legendary items are now going to be much more simple. You're not going to have any of the conditional affixes. You're primarily just going to be getting things like main stats, damage increases to specific damage types. All of the more simple and basic affixes is what you're primarily going to be getting on dropped items. But one of the big themes of season 4 is the dropped item is the start of the journey for that item. So getting, say, a legendary item with 3 affixes on it is kind of the base now. Then past that point is where a lot of the complexity and more interesting affixes are going to come into play. And then on top of all of that itemization, we also have one of the new systems with this season being greater affixes. So any ancestral item now has a chance to drop with a greater affix that massively increases the power of that affix. So let's say before you could get an item with an intelligence roll of up to 100. Now, if you get it as a greater affix, it could roll up to 150 intelligence, but it will also always be that 150 intelligence. So it increases that affix roll by 50% and always makes it a guaranteed max roll. And every affix on a dropped legendary or unique item can also be a greater affix. So you could potentially get a unique item with 4 greater affix rolls, which would mean it's all max rolls and they're all 50% stronger than they normally could be. So this is going to be adding quite a lot of excitement to just playing the game, because you could get a drop of the unique item that you're using in your build, and that could potentially have greater affix rolls on it, which would be one of the most exciting items you're going to be able to be obtaining. This also does include uber uniques, so you can get uber uniques with greater affixes on them, but that obviously is going to be so absurdly rare that would just be an incredibly rare drop on top of an incredibly rare drop. So that's not something you should be expecting, but it is something that's possible, so that could happen to you once every couple seasons. Now, one of the big changes from the PTR feedback is the different look for greater affixes. So now when you see an item with a greater affix on it on the ground, there's going to be a new symbol to the right side of the name. And if I'm not mistaken, the symbol will change depending on how many greater affixes are actually on that item. So it's just a little star that I think gets a bit more intricate. And an even bigger change is that while in your inventory, this symbol will also be shown. So while you're looking through your inventory, you can very easily and quickly see what items have greater affixes on them. So once you get super late into the end game, you're level 100, you already have good gear. Now, any item that doesn't have the symbol for a greater affix on it, you know you can just very easily scrap everything else that doesn't have a greater affix on it. And even though you're not able to add greater affixes to items or anything like that, it'll still be impacted by one of the new crafting systems. Now, speaking of crafting systems, we have the first of which is the tempering system. Now, this is basically a new system that allows you to add more interesting affixes to all of your legendary items. And once you get up to ancestral, you'll be able to add 2 new affixes to every single one of your legendary items. So you'll get a legendary drop, it'll have 3 affixes, then you'll be able to temper it to add 2 more, much more unique and interesting affixes. Now, to start off with the tempering system, you have to go find and unlock tempering manuals, which is a selection of affixes that are grouped together. And when you want to go put a tempering affix on an item, you choose manuals, and then it'll randomly take one of those affixes from that manual and put it on the item. These manuals are permanent, so once you find one, you can always use it. And every manual will have 3 to 5 affixes on them, and all of those affixes will be different depending on what category that manual is in and if it's generic or class specific. specific. So let's say you want to temper on a weapon, you go to the vendor, put it in a slot, and then you'll choose what category of affix you want to put on it. So for a weapon, you can only use manuals from weapons or offensive, and then you'd be able to select from any generic or class specific manual that is in the weapon or offensive category. And on top of that, you also won't be able to stack two affixes from the same category. So you can't go put affixes on a weapon and put two offensive affixes on it. You'd have to do one weapon and one offensive. And every item has different categories you can put on it. For instance, a necklace can put all but weapon affixes on them, which is again pretty similar to legendary aspects. Now, as mentioned, you'll be able to add two affixes to every ancestral legendary item, but after you add those two affixes, what if they're affixes you don't actually want? Because as we went over, the manuals have 3 to 5 affixes and it randomly rolls one of those on the item. So at that point, you'll have a handful of rerolls to be able to reroll those affixes. I think it's currently sitting at 7 rerolls if I'm not mistaken, but then if you go through and use up all of your rerolls, you don't get any more. That item is technically bricked, but with this system, you're not actually bricking an item, you're not actually removing anything. You may just have a tempering affix that you can't use or isn't the exact one you wanted. So you're not fully bricking an item, but that item could potentially be much weaker than it could have been if you got the roll you were actually looking for. Now, the actual affixes you're able to be putting on items through the tempering system is going to be much more interesting. This system is going to house all of the most interesting affixes, including a ton of new ones. So one of the big new additions is multicast. Anytime you cast a certain spell, you have a chance to cast another one. You also have new affixes increasing the radius of items. That is actually something that was changed from the PTR. Now, if you're using increase radius to skills as an affix, those are capped at 100% increase, but because of how these area affixes actually work, it would actually be capped out at 4 times the normal size of a spell. So you're still going to be able to get spells to cover basically the entirety of your screen. And then you're also going to have tons of other affixes. They even added a ton of the conditional affixes that you could usually get on items into the system. So instead of having dozens of conditional items that can drop on items, now they're in this system. So if you still want to use those, you actually have the choice of adding them on items instead of needing to sift through items on the ground with 4 different conditional affixes that are really hard to initially sift through. And the main changes they made to this system from the PTR is mainly quality of life stuff. You can skip through the animation of adding tempering affixes. They give you more information on the roll ranges when adding tempering affixes. So if you tested this on the PTR, it's going to be pretty much the same, just with a bit more quality of life. And for the second new crafting edition, which is kind of the end of that item's journey, is the Masterworking system. This is a replacement for the upgrade system we had previously, where you could upgrade all items 5 times. That gave them some increase to stats. Now we have the Masterworking system. Now the Masterworking system allows you to upgrade items 12 different times. And this is going to be split into 3 different sections. So you have the first section of 4 upgrades, the second section, the third section. Each of these sections is actually going to take a new resource, which is going to come from the new endgame pit activity. And the fourth and final upgrade of each one of these 3 sections is going to be a bigger upgrade. So the first 3 upgrades you put on an item increases all of its affixes by 5% per upgrade. So upgrade 1 is 5%, upgrade 2 is 5%, upgrade 3 is 5%. But then that fourth upgrade of all 3 sections is going to upgrade 1 affix by 25%. Now what's super crazy with this system is that 25% upgrade in all 3 of the different upgrade sections can all land on the same affix, or they could land on 3 different affixes, or 2 could land on 1 affix and 1 could land on another. So there is quite a lot of optimization you can get with this system, because you could just land all of those upgrades on the same affix. That's the best affix for your build, and now you just have some absurd increase in the affix on a specific item, and you can upgrade every single item on your character, including unique items, which it also gets pretty crazy with, because unique items have unique affixes, and you could upgrade those 12 times and get 3 of the big upgrades on 1 unique affix that's only on that 1 unique item. That could just give you some crazy power increase. But because there's quite a lot of RNG in the system, you can reset the Masterworking system. So if you go upgrade an item 12 times, but those big upgrades land on bad affixes, you can reset that item. It'll only remove all the upgrades. It'll keep all of the affixes the same as they were before upgrading, and then you can redo the Masterworking system. Now you lose all those resources you used, you don't get them back, but if you have like a god rolled item and then you want to get god rolled Masterworking working on it, you could keep resetting it if you have the resources to keep upgrading it, to try to get all of those big upgrades on the affixes you want. And this is basically the finishing portion of your item's journey. This is going to add a ridiculous amount of power, and again, it's able to be done on unique items, which is quite interesting. Now, one of the big changes they made from the PTR is that you used to be able to fail these upgrades. So once you got to the second and third tiers, it wouldn't be 100% chance to hit an upgrade. When you actually tried to upgrade, it would go down to say like 70%. And then if you failed an upgrade, it would give you a higher chance on the next attempt. But now that has been removed. It is now always 100% chance to upgrade, but the resources have been slightly adjusted. So it's probably going to be slightly more expensive, but you can no longer fail. And the reason they wanted to make this change is because that's basically just adding RNG on top of RNG, because this system does have quite a bit of RNG, specifically around those big upgrades and what affixes they land on. They didn't also want a chance to fail an upgrade. So that's a simplified version of all of the overhauls and new crafting additions we're getting with Season 4, but then we have a ton of overhauls and new additions for actual pieces of content, starting off with the big overhaul to Helltides. So Helltides have basically had all of the cool open world elements from Season 2 Blood Harvest added into them. And first off being the threat meter. So as you kill enemies in Helltide, you're building up this threat meter. Once this threat meter is filled, it'll start spawning big groups of enemies on you to drain it. Once it's fully drained and you killed all those waves of enemies, then a new Hellborn enemy will spawn, which are basically the Helltide equivalent to Bloodborne from Season 2, which are basically just corrupted versions of the playable classes. And that will be a pretty strong mini boss. It gives you a ton of additional loot. And in Season 4, those will always drop the new Mind Cage elixirs that we went over. But that's just the first part, because Helltides themselves have actually been pretty significantly changed. There's going to be new small events everywhere, kind of similar to Blood Harvest. So maybe there'll be a small totem you go destroy that spawns of a bunch of elites. Maybe there'll be a few citizens you go and save, and those will spawn a bunch of elites while doing it. When you're just randomly walking around, random little events will spawn on you. One of the coolest ones being a Hellworm will pop out of the ground and spew out tons and tons of elites on top of you and just spawn a bunch of these enemies. So you'll be able to kill all those for tons of cinders, tons of loot, because it's so many different elites. And then just walking around, you'll randomly get spawns of big groups of enemies sometimes. Just the overall density, because of all these new events, because of these Hellworms, there's just going to be tons more enemies everywhere, tons more little events and things to interact with. So that mixed with the threat meter, you're just going to be facing waves and waves of enemies at all times. But on top of that, there's also going to be a new boss to summon in Helltides. There's going to be a new currency that you can get throughout the zone from opening up chests, defeating mini bosses, and these are Baneful Hearts, and you can then go use these Baneful Hearts at basically the center of the Helltides. There's going to be a summoning pedestal with 3 little pillars, and you need 3 Baneful Hearts, and that will summon a bunch of waves of enemies that will then summon the Blood Maiden, which is a new big boss for the area that's very strong. In the PTR, it had like as much health as world bosses, but you can go on to defeat the Blood Maiden, get tons of new loot, and this is also just in the Helltide zone. Tons of people can group up and just keep spamming out these Blood Maidens like you may have done in Season 2 Blood Harvest, and you'll actually be getting some additional loot if you use one of your Baneful Hearts. So if there's 3 of you there, you all use a Baneful Heart, you all get additional loot. But let's say there's 6 of you there, 3 people don't use Baneful Hearts, they'll still be getting loot, but the people who use hearts will get some additional. So this will just be a really cool event to just build up a bunch of players and constantly spam out these bosses and waves of enemies to get tons of really good loot. And as we mentioned earlier, there's also going to be the Iron Wolves and Helltides now, so there's going to be whispers for the Iron Wolves. We're going to have the Season 4 reputation specifically tied to Helltides, and then we're going to have all the permanent additions with Helltides that will continue to be in the game past Season 4. So just a massive Helltide overhaul in basically every way. And some of the changes they made from PTR is they reduced the channel time to open all of the Helltide specific chests. It still has a little bit of a channel time, so if you accidentally do it, you have enough time to cancel, but you can now open those more easily because there's so many enemies around. You're just constantly getting that canceled. And they actually increased the cinder drop rate, because on the PTR, even though there were so many more enemies, it still didn't feel like the cinder drop rate was buffed up enough, so they buffed that up even more. But the Helltide is incredibly fun now. They basically added everything that was good from all the other systems like Helltides, added them all in the Helltides, and now it's an incredibly fun system. And then for a pretty big piece of new content, we're getting the Pit of Artificers, which is basically an upgraded version of Greater greater rifts from Diablo 3. This is going to be a new endgame system. You only unlock this when you've completed a level 46 nightmare dungeon. All of the enemies start at level 100 in here, and that's at floor 1, but there's going to be like 200 floors added with season 4. They're also already talking about adding more floors with new seasons. So when those higher floors, you can really test your build in this new content. This is going to take a new resource that you get from pretty much doing anything throughout the game, and you just need to use one of this new resource to open up any level of the pit, but you really shouldn't have issues running out of this resource a ton. And as mentioned, these are basically greater rifts. You go in, you kill enemies to fill up a bar. Once that bar is filled, a portal spawns to a boss at the end. You kill that boss and you've completed that run, and no enemies drop loot until the end. The boss at the end drops a ton of loot, and if you beat the run before the timer ends, you get a chest that gives you the Masterworking materials. As we went over, the Masterworking is split into 3 different tiers. Tier 1 requires a resource from the pits for the lower levels. Tier 2 requires a resource from the pits medium levels, and then Tier 3 requires more end game pit materials. But what's also really nice about this system is that if you're getting those Tier 3 materials from the pit, you can actually downgrade those into the other tiers of materials, because let's say you reset an item in the Masterworking system. For those first 4 upgrades, you still have to use the Tier 1 material. If you're already super late into the end game, you could just downgrade your materials and be able to continue through that Masterworking system. So this is a really cool new activity. The density is really good in the pit. You can just blast through everything without having to loot. You get to a boss at the end, you kill that. That ties back into the Masterworking system. Very good new piece of content. And also the boss at the end of the dungeon are basically the dungeon bosses from all the other dungeons, but there's actually going to be a new mechanic in the boss fights where shades of any other boss throughout the game can spawn in and use their abilities. So there'll be like these dark red shades that come in and they'll cast these red abilities everywhere. So for instance, a Echo of Lilith can spawn into your boss fight and do her waves of dread at you. So any boss throughout the game can just randomly show up and do an attack against you, making those boss fights quite a bit more interesting. And that brings us to the final big addition for all of these overhauls, which are some pretty significant changes to the boss ladders. Now the boss ladders are all of the end game bosses that you need to find boss summoning materials to summon them. All of the bosses have very high chance to drop specific unique items. That ends with Duriel, where he has the best chance in the game to drop uber unique items. The first addition is they're adding Andariel, which is going to be very similar to Duriel. She's going to have the same drop rate for uber uniques as Duriel, but she's going to take different boss summoning materials. So before you had to go through a certain section of the game to get Duriel's materials, now you go through the other bosses to get Andariel's. So just another new boss fight that will basically allow you to get a lot more chances at uber unique items. Now on top of that, we're getting a whole new difficulty to every single boss fight in the boss ladder, being tormented echoes of these boss fights. And this actually ties back into the Pit of the Artificers, where once you complete any tier of the pit, you have a chance to get Stygian stones from killing the boss. You use these Stygian stones along with a bunch of boss summoning materials to summon these level 200 versions of all of the boss ladder bosses. So before, if you were say level 100 and you went and fought the Beast of Ice, the Beast of Ice would still be level 85. Wouldn't be super difficult, but now you could just use some of these Stygian stones and more boss summoning materials and face a level 200 version of Beast of the Ice. And you could do this with every other boss, level 200 Duriels and Dariels, any of the bosses you can do level 200 versions of. These are incredibly difficult bosses. They will all have an increased uber drop chance, and they will drop mountains of loot. And this is actually one of the big changes from the PTR feedback. On the PTR, it took 5 times the boss summoning materials to summon that boss. It gave 5 times the loot. But now it's only going to take 3 times the boss summoning materials, but it's still going to give 5 times the loot. This is to make up for these bosses being very difficult. So now if you have a strong enough build to farm the level 200 versions, the level 200 versions are just going to be much more lucrative and much more efficient than farming the normal versions of all of these bosses. So these level 200 uber bosses are going to be absolutely juiced in terms of difficulty, absolutely juiced in terms of loot drops. And they also made another change to the boss ladder from the PTR in that they've rebalanced a lot of these bosses, because they need all of these bosses at the level 200 version to be the same on difficulty, because the first tormented boss you kill, you'll also get a resplendent spark. So it doesn't matter which one you kill, you just kill one and you'll get one resplendent spark. You don't get one for each of the bosses bosses you kill, just 1 in total. And on top of that, they did also add a Resplendent Spark as a reward for defeating Uber Lilith. So if you're keeping count in season 4, you'll be able to get 3 Resplendent Sparks decently easily, 1 for your first tormented boss, 1 for Uber Lilith, and 1 for completing the Iron Wolf reputation page. Now this is pretty important because you only need 4 sparks to craft an Uber unique item. So in season 4, if you do all of those, the first Uber unique you get as a normal drop will allow you to get any Uber unique you want, because if you get an Uber unique drop that you don't want, you just scrap that. Now you have 4 sparks and you craft any Uber unique you actually want. So that's actually going to be pretty cool for season 4. And I think most people who are getting to level 100 doing all the most difficult content should be able to get at least that 1 Uber unique they want decently easily. But that's pretty much all of the big overhauls, all the changes, all the new content we're getting for season 4 of Diablo 4. It's all looking pretty incredible. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.